Good afternoon, everyone. If we could all take our seats. Seems like forever that we've seen each other, right? So, welcome back and welcome to our candidates in Chicago Heights. Happy 2019 and happy Epiphany also. I hope that your celebration of the Feast of Christmas held many Christmas moments for you that you can treasure throughout this 2019. Thank you for the many Christmas moments that you provide through your smiles and greetings, which we've certainly received today, through your cards and your gifts, and especially through your prayers and presence. We really appreciate your presence in our life. It makes a world of difference. I was struck this morning at Mass by the words of the first reading from Isaiah. Rise up in splendor, your light has come, the glory of the Lord shines upon you. Enough for us to hold on to as hope and a message for our new year. Our speaker today is Sister Marcelline Koch, who will be speaking on Catholic social teachings. How many years have I known him? Sister Marcelline, as you know, is one of our Dominican sisters, and she directs the Office of Justice for our congregation. In this capacity, she serves as the Justice Promoter, the co-coordinator of the Springfield Dominican Anti-Racism Team also, and liaison for our congregation's socially responsible investing effort. In March of 2014, she was also named the North American Co-Promoter for Justice for the Dominican family in North America. It was in this capacity that she was part of a delegation to Iraq in 2015. Previous to this ministry, Sister was our congregation's leadership team for 8 years. She also directed Project Irene, an education and advocacy initiative focused on women and children. Sister Marcelline was an elementary school educator and administrator for over 30 years, serving both in urban and rural areas. And so we welcome Sister Marcelline today.
Thanks, Sister Mary Jo, and it's wonderful to be with you today. Catholic social teaching is one of my favorite pieces, one of my favorite things to talk about. But to lead into our day, I do want to have a time of a short prayer. You have on your first sheet there something that I prepared for today. The first few paragraphs talk about is that we can pray separately for justice and peace in our world. But it says it's important to keep in mind that the entire liturgy of the church is a prayer for justice and peace. It's not separate from the Eucharistic liturgy that we celebrate, or benediction, or whatever else we celebrate together. All of those pieces are part of the truth and the life, the sanctity and grace, justice and love and peace, which is a part of our heritage. So remembering that, we still are using a prayer today focused on justice and peace, but with the idea that all of our prayer experiences are part of that as well. So you see the song, Peace, Salam, Shalom. I'll sing it through once. You'll pick it up, and then I'll ask you to sing it with me, and we'll do it a few times to open our prayer. Peace, Salam, Shalom. 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 Again. Peace, Shalom, Shalom. Peace, Shalom, Shalom. Peace, Shalom, Shalom. Peace, Shalom, Shalom. So taking the word of peace in English, Arabic, and Hebrew, we have our opening prayer.
Grant us, God, a vision of your world as your love would have it, A world where the weak are protected and none go hungry or poor. A world where the riches of creation are shared and everyone can enjoy them. A world where different races and cultures live in harmony and mutual respect. A world where peace is built with justice, and justice is guided by love. Give us the inspiration and courage to build it through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen.
And we have a short reading based on Isaiah that Daniel's going to do.
This is the fast that pleases us, that pleases me, to break unjust fetters, to let the oppressed go free, to share your bread with the hungry and shelter the homeless poor. If you do away with the yoke, the clenched fist, the wicked word, if you give your bread to the hungry and relief to the oppressed, your light will rise in the darkness.
And we close together. Give
Give us, O God, the vision which can see your love in the world, in spite of human failures. Give us the faith to trust your goodness, in spite of our ignorance and weakness. Give us the knowledge that we may continue to pray with understanding hearts, and show us what each one of us can do to set forward the coming of the day of universal peace. Amen.
So all of those things that were talked about in our prayer will be, in a sense, a focus of what we are about today. Catholic social teaching. It's about promoting justice and peace. This call to promote justice and peace is nothing less than the call to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and to evangelize the world. It's not different from that. They're really essential elements of Jesus' own description of his mission when he went to the synagogue in Nazareth. You recognize this. To bring good news to the poor about economic justice. Freedom to prisoners or offenders, the whole part of forgiveness and mercy. Health to the blind, the sick, and the afflicted, so the healing ministry that we are about. And liberation of the oppressed, for justice in the political world. These are elements that Jesus incarnated in his ministry, and he commissioned us to replicate them in our hearts, in our communities, in our societies, and in our world. But the richness of our tradition on Catholic social teaching is more than a list of principles. It's a living and breathing tradition. It's meant so that we can orient our lives and our communities that we're a part of toward a right relationship with God, with ourselves and others, and that includes our planet as well. Now, Vatican II focused on this understanding of Jesus, especially in the document Gaudium et Spes. And soon afterward, Pope Paul VI established what he called the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, to remind the Church that work for justice and peace is central to the Church's mission. So what Pope Francis has done, he's really moved that and our understanding to a new level. And this was in January of 2017. So he merged 4 pontifical councils, including that Justice and Peace one. And he formed a new dicastery for promoting integral human development. Now, don't be alarmed by the word dicastery. It's a Vatican word. It simply means a department. So it's the department for promoting integral human development. And it combined things because they are integrated. And this dicastery is focusing on issues regarding migrants, any of those in need, the sick, the excluded, marginalized, the imprisoned, the unemployed, as well as victims of conflict, armed conflict, natural disasters, and all kinds of slavery and torture. And so he's moved it to even a different level of thinking for us. In 1971, in the U.S. Senate, or not the U.S., the World Synod of Bishops, the document that they wrote had these words in it, and in some form, where it says that action on behalf of justice is constitutive to the gospel. And that's what I've been saying all along. It's not separate from. Many decades ago, when I was interested in this, in the whole issue of justice and peace, it was, you lived your religious life or your spiritual life in the church or whatever, and if you did anything with concerning justice, it was on the side, it was separate from. And we have learned that it's not an optional extra. And since that time, since 1971, it has continued to be a focus of papal teaching as well. So if it's central to the Christian discipleship, to the gospel, it's intrinsic to our baptismal and Dominican call. It's not a call to say, oh, you've got to stop what you're doing and go pick up some other word. No, not at all. It's a call to see the goal of justice and peace, which is bringing the good news and helping to free others, as the perspective that shapes and flavors everything we do. It's like we use this word lens for other things. It's using that lens as you go about your life and your work. Now, since the time of Jesus, the church has been struggling, and in fact in every age, to be faithful to doing this. And so over time, there have been a body, we've had scripture, we've had the words of Jesus, and we've had other writings, we've had encyclicals from the church. And there's come to be a body of teaching developed by the church on some of these matters. It's interesting that from the time of Jesus, there have been issues about poverty and wealth. There have been issues about war and peace. And then there have been other issues relating to economics, how the people in society organize themselves, and the role of the state in the life of people. And all of this came to be known as Catholic social teaching. It's a very rich treasure for us, and one that a lot of our people in our church do not know. Now, the time of modern Catholic social teaching is considered to have begun in 1891 with the encyclical Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII. And if you can place that in history, this was about the plight of workers and industrial capitalism, because we had the industrialization during that time. And since that time, there have been other encyclicals and documents. And you have a paper that looks like this. And what I've tried to do for you, on the front says Major Vatican Documents. And these aren't all of them, but it gives you a sense, if you run down through the years, the kinds of things that have been written about. It goes up to Pope Francis and on the one for Care for Our Common Home, Laudato Si, that he wrote. On the back of this sheet, I pulled out some of the U.S. bishops' major statements, starting in 1919. And I'm going to notice the last one in the last column is the most recent. It was November of 2018 that the U.S. bishops approved the letter on racism, Open Wide Our Hearts, which is the newest one. It was in 1979 was the last one that the U.S. bishops, their pastoral on racism. So that is the recent piece for that. But that just gives you a few. Now, we're not going to look at each one of those today. I've often said that if you read some of the encyclicals of the past, they're good material for putting you to sleep. They're often hard to read, you know, they're a bit dense, and yet they have really good wisdom in them. Pope Francis writes a little bit differently, so if you've read his, you know that they're easier reading for you. And now, before moving on to the principles themselves, I'd like to just bring this up. We talk about, when we do the work of justice, we talk about walking with 2 feet. And 1 foot is the foot of direct service. It's the foot of helping people survive their present crisis. We do that very well. We do the food pantries. We do the homeless shelters. We have ways of trying to get health care to some people in crisis. And then the other foot is the one of social change. And this one is not as easy to do. It's much harder. It's often frowned upon by a lot of society. You're trying to upset the status quo. But it's looking at removing the causes of the social problems by changing the structures. What is the structure that keeps people homeless? What is the structure that doesn't allow people to have enough money to buy food? Those are the questions being asked. I always remember Dom Helder Cameron. He was a bishop in South America, and I don't remember his country right now. It was Brazil? Brazil? Okay. And he used to say, if I feed people, I'm praised. And if I ask why they're hungry, I'm called a communist. And so that's exactly what we're talking about here. We can feed people, but then to ask why they're hungry, that's a different story. But that's what we want to be involved in. Another part that goes with this, you've heard probably this adage that says, if you give a man a fish, or give a person a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach him how to fish, he eats for a lifetime. However, if you use this with it, I heard someone add to that quote, and they said, teaching someone to fish so they can eat for a lifetime is great and all, but we also need to ask, who owns the lake? Why do only certain people get the opportunity to fish? And how did the lake end up so polluted? So there are more issues than just giving the person a fish to eat. Now, as we look at the themes for Catholic social teaching, I will add some thoughts and facts to flesh out different contexts. I can't begin to do all of them, but Catholic social teaching calls us, all of us, to make connections and to live out of what we know. So as you listen to the issues that I lift up, pay attention to the fact that other themes fit the issue. For instance, one of the themes is the dignity of the human person. That can go across many of them. And that issues are interrelated. There's a connection between homelessness and having not enough food to eat, and how our economy works, and who gets the high salaries. There's a connection in all of that. So, before we start, what I like to do, and you'll need this sheet next. This is the one. There are 7 principles, and I would like 7 persons to volunteer. If there are 7 associates or associate candidates, maybe candidates especially, if they would volunteer, and when it comes time for that particular principle, I'll call on that person to read it aloud. I know that everybody here can read, but sometimes saying things aloud puts it into the room in a different way. So, number 1, the dignity of the human person. Okay, I forgot your name.
Kathy.
Kathy, okay. And number 2, say your name.
Jen.
Jen. Number 3, Madonna, was it? Okay. Number 4, Ralph. 5, Mary Kay. And then you're Jen also? Okay. And then I saw a hand over here. Okay, Pat, for number 7. Okay. All right, so we will begin this way. So we'll start with the first one, the dignity of the human person. So, Kathy, if you will read that for us.
As children of God, created in God's image, human persons have a permanent place in creation.
Hello?
Yeah, thank you.
There is a unique and sacred worth that is present in each person simply because she or he exists. Human dignity is not earned by achievements nor bestowed by any authorities other than God. It is not dependent on race, creed, color, economic class, political power, social status, culture, personal abilities, gender, sexual orientation, or any other dimensions by which people discriminate social groupings.
Thank you. In one sense, this seems like a no-brainer. Surely everybody respects the dignity of all. However, if you pay attention in our world, you know that a common response is that some people count more than others. And you can picture that and figure it out for yourself. And so our part is how to resist buying into that. We have a corporate stance, which I'll refer to later, but our corporate stance is on the consistent ethic of life. And it speaks to this in our commitment to the whole of life on earth. It says that it includes those in the womb, the newborn, the children growing up, the disabled, the well-abled, the healthy, the sick, the dying. All have dignity. Pope Francis has said, peace is threatened by every denial of human dignity. I want to share with you a story from our Dominican history that speaks to this dignity of persons. Bartolomé de las Casas lived in the 15th and 16th century. He was a priest, a diocesan priest at the time. He traveled to the New World, to Hispaniola, which is Dominican Republic, Haiti. And like all the explorers, even the church leaders that went along, he owned slaves in the New World. After hearing a sermon, he began to see things differently, and he freed his slaves. He eventually joined the Dominican order and argued for the humanity of the Indians. And whom did he hear in that sermon? It was a Sunday in Advent in 1511. Antonio Montesinos was the preacher. Montesinos was a Dominican in a small Dominican community. They had come there a year before, so they lived there for 1 year and observed what was happening. And so as a community, they talked about what they wanted to say, and they chose Montesinos, their best preacher, to say it. We have these words from his preaching because Las Casas noted them and has recorded them for us. And his words said, "By what right or justice do you keep the Indians in such horrible servitude? Are they not human? Have they not rational souls? Are you not bound them to love them as you love yourselves?" And he was crying out for the dignity of the native peoples of this world. One of our efforts in terms of respecting the dignity of others is our anti-racism work. As a congregation, we have a commitment to be on the path to becoming an anti-racist congregation. And to move the effort forward, we established a team. That was in 2004, so we've been doing this work for almost 15 years. The people that trained us says it's a 30 to 40 year work, so we're not there yet. But on our team, we currently have 45 members. About half are sisters, and the other half are our partners, mostly persons of color. And I know that in another session, you're going to hear more about the anti-racism work, so I won't lift up any more about it right now. But I do want to share it as a dignity of persons. And so we'll move on to the second one about our rights and responsibilities.
Human dignity can be protected and a healthy community can be achieved only if basic human rights are protected and responsibilities are met. Therefore, every person has a fundamental right to life and a right to those things required for human decency. They include civil, political, and socioeconomic rights. They are to be recognized by communities and governments. They do not derive from the dictates of governments, nor are they earned or won by successful competition in the marketplace. This is the responsibility of each to respect and protect the human rights of all. Corresponding to these rights are duties and responsibilities to respect the rights of others and to work for the common good.
Thank you. Last month, December 10th, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, which encompasses the rights that Jen just was reading about. This was adopted in 1948, and it grew out of what happened in World War II. World War II was considered an awful, awful war, as all wars are. But some dynamics changed because of Nazism and fascism in that war. Before that time, you couldn't have had a discussion about the idea of governments needing and their relationship to the rights of their people. You wouldn't have not been able to have that same kind of conversation. But because of what happened in that war, then that conversation began to surface. And so these were developed. This picture with Eleanor Roosevelt, she was the chairperson of the UN Commission on Human Rights. And there were representatives from countries around the world who worked together to define the most essential universal rights and establish them in an official document. There are 30 articles to the universal document itself. And it was proclaimed by the UN Assembly as a common standard. And while it's not legally binding, it is a living document that's been accepted as a contract between a government and its people throughout the world. And it is recognized. There are places in the world that, in trying to get their rights in their country, do refer to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It was in 2016, as a part of the 800-year celebration of the Dominican Order, that we Dominicans held a Congress on the promotion and defense of human rights. And it was held in Salamanca, Spain. Salamanca was chosen because of the university there and because the Dominicans have had a presence in Salamanca since the 1500s. Over 200 Dominican sisters, friars, laity, and colleagues gathered to continue the work of those early friars. Now, you remember I told you about Las Casas and Montesinos? Okay, they were in Hispaniola. They would sometimes travel back to Spain, or they would write letters. They informed the Dominicans at the university what was going on in the New World, and this wasn't right, but they shared the experience. Then the academics took that and began to write about it. And in fact, those writings are considered the basis for international law on human rights. And one of the Dominicans is recognized for his part of that, is Francisco Vitoria. So our connection to this is long-standing. Along with human rights are, of course, responsibilities. We know that in our own family. You have rights, but you also have responsibilities. And I really think there's a basic human drive that people want to be involved and they want to be responsible for decisions that are going to shape their life. we share responsibility. You do it in your families, you do it in your workplace, you do it in your neighborhoods, and so on, all around, all the way up to the whole world. And people have a right to be involved and a responsibility to participate in the political institutions. And our church supports that. Before every election, the U.S. bishops publish the Faithful Citizenship brochure, emphasizing values to be remembered as people are voting. The hard part today is that being involved politically is really an uphill struggle. There's a great deal of cynicism about it. There's the polarization, and the more extreme polarization that means that it's not even easy, or it's not sometimes not even possible to have conversations with somebody who thinks differently than you do. So that's a hard piece for us, but we can't give up on it. Another responsibility and involvement for us is has to do with the United Nations. This is a quote from Dag Hammarskjöld. It's on the wall if you take a tour of the UN. Because people criticize the UN a lot. And he maintains the UN wasn't created to take humanity to heaven, but it was created to save it from hell. And I suppose there is a difference in that. And the UN is the only institution we have that can bring countries together to talk, to negotiate, and to plan. What I also think is revealing about it is the world can spend so much on their military, but contribute so little to the goals of global security, international cooperation, and peace. The UN's entire budget is approximately 2% of what the world spends on military. That's a very small piece of the whole picture. And now we will move on to our community and the common good. And we go to Madonna, I think.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. The human person is both sacred and social. Human dignity can be recognized, developed, and protected only in community with others. Each person is brother or sister to every other and can develop as a healthy human person only in a community of relationships rooted in love and justice. The foundational community for each person is his or her immediate family. The full community of Earth is the extended family of the whole human race through history within the larger community of created being. Each person benefits from the efforts of earlier generations and of their contemporaries and are therefore under obligation to them as well.
So listening to what Madonna read, we know that we don't live our faith totally alone. We live it in community. In proclaiming the reign of God, Jesus envisioned a new way of being together. He envisioned a community that was characterized not by exclusion, by privilege, or discrimination. He envisioned a community that was defined by equality, inclusion, and embrace. It was a radical idea in Jesus' time, and I think it still is, because you hear the language in our general society, and you hear the exclusion, the privilege, and the discrimination. So, another piece of this, I think, is that community forms the basis and reason for doing what all these other principles call for. It's because of our being in community and what we have together and what we can do together. I noticed on that last thing that Madonna read, it says, each person benefits from the efforts of earlier generations. You know, we have this myth of the self-made person, or a self-made company rather. You know, I did it all by myself, or I pulled myself up by my bootstraps or whatever. I always think, first of all, to do that you have to have boots. You know, some people don't even have boots. But anyway, the myth of the self-made person is not true. Nobody is self-made. Even if your company does something, you're building on the knowledge and what has been done before. So we depend on each other for all of that. And then it mentions the common good. What the common good is saying is that the good, the well-being of each person is connected to everybody else's good. And as we look at creation, we know that the well-being of all creation, both human and non-human, is all connected to the good of others. And I read something recently that we've lost some of that, because once we think we've achieved something for ourselves, then I'm not concerned whether somebody else has it or not. And the common good says, my concern needs to be for the total of all of us in this and what we can do and be together. Okay, we'll move on to the fourth one.
Option for the poor. Scripture teaches that God has a special concern for the poor and vulnerable. The church calls on all of us to put the needs of the poor and vulnerable first. This preferential option for the poor and vulnerable should be reflected in both our daily lives and public policies. A fundamental measure of our society is how we care for and stand with our poor and vulnerable brothers and sisters.
Catholic teaching calls us to seek the common good of all creation. But Scripture and our Catholic tradition also calls us to this priority concern that Ralph just read about. Pope Francis has talked a lot about this. He said we're called to be a church of the poor for the poor. And so much of what he says is a challenge to us to be for those who are poor. He goes on to say, on the global level, we see a scandalous gap between the opulence of the wealthy and the utter destitution of the poor. Often we only need to walk the streets of a city to see the contrast between people living on the street and the brilliant lights of the store windows. And then this is the part where he says, we have become so accustomed to these things that they no longer unsettle us. I don't know, are any of you familiar with Greg Boyle, who does the Homeboy Industries? Greg Boyle is a Jesuit who is in Los Angeles area, and he works in the hood. And then they were in the hood, and he works with gang members trying to get them out of the gangs. So he developed Homeboy Industries as a way, as a business, to employ them after he can help them get rid of their gang tattoos and all of that. But anyway, he's a very interesting speaker if you ever hear him. But I love what he says in this line. He said, we need to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry and not stand in judgment about how they carry it. And that is a challenge to me. Ron Rolheiser is a spiritual writer, an oblate priest, and he notes that 1 out of 10 sentences in the New Testament is a direct challenge to do something for the poor. So this hasn't been left out of our gospel. And I want to be very clear to say that of itself, wealth is not evil. That isn't the evil part. It's wealth alongside poverty that's abhorrent to our God. You know the scripture story of the rich man and Lazarus? And Lazarus was outside the house of the rich man, and the rich man's dogs would lick his sores and so on. And the rich man ended up in hell. The rich man was in hell not because he was rich, but because of his riches, he didn't see Lazarus in need. And that's where the crux of this comes in. Now, I want to do some pieces that talk a little bit about trends in our world and some just the reality pieces. This is called the champagne glass distribution of income. And this is income, not wealth. Income is what you get in your paycheck. Wealth is what is all your accumulated assets. And so there's some good news in our world that by some measures, global poverty has fallen over the last decade. However, 71% of the world's population remain low income or poor. So that isn't very good news. So you see that we have the richest 20% of the world, now this is world, not US, have almost 83% of the wealth. And this was done a number of years ago, but it's still, I've looked it up every year and it still proves true. And then you can see as it goes down, you get down to the poorest 20%, they have 1.4% of the wealth. So it has shown all along how, or rather income, how it is skewed toward the top 20%. If you think about our world, almost half of the world, over 3 billion people live in less than $2.50 a day. And I know that sometimes people don't like statistics and don't like numbers. But sometimes we need to look at them because they tell us something. I don't know if you know Oxfam. It's an international group that works on poverty. And they publish this report on poverty before all the elite political and business guys meet in Davos, Switzerland. You read about those meetings in the paper. Their January 2018 report said that 82% of all the wealth generated in 2017 went to the richest 1% of the global population. That's pretty significant. And the people that made up the lower half of our world, of the poorest, saw no increase at all. Now, it's kind of hard to grasp how money is concentrated in just a few hands in a lopsided economy, but here's a start. And I'm going to use some names, and it is nothing personal to these wealthy people. It's how the system is set up. The richest 3 people in the US, Jeff Bezos, Amazon. And it bothers me every time I have to order from Amazon. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett together have more wealth than the entire bottom half of the country combined. So the 3 of them have as much wealth as half of our country, the bottom half. That's 3 people versus 160 million. So you get a sense of this. You get a sense of it. There's even more written up anymore about when the wealth is it's the expanding fortunes of multi-generational wealth dynasties, families that pass it on. So the grandparents and parents did the work, and the next generation, inherits it. And so the 3 wealthiest families in the U.S. are the Waltons of Walmart, the Mars Candy Company, and the Koch brothers. And they spell it K-O-C-H, and they're no relation to me. But their enterprises were all built by grandparents or parents. And their combined wealth is 4 million times the median wealth of a U.S. family. So you get some sense of the imbalance in this and what it means. Now, I have a little exercise that I like to do because it talks about how wealth is distributed in our country, and I think it matters for us to understand this. So I need 10 folks, and I've got 10 chairs over here. So I need 10 folks, particularly I'd like candidates if possible, to come and sit on a chair. I won't embarrass you. You don't have to say anything. All you have to do is move. That's all you have to do. You just have to stand up or sit down. So, do I have 10 folks that can do this? Good. So if you think about this, that each chair represents 10% of the wealth, not income, I'm talking wealth now in the U.S. And each person is 10% of the population. So what we have here is, what you see right now is not how life is in our country, right? And we would all guess that right away. So we're going to go back to 1976. And in 1976, are you Morris? Morris, okay. Well, let Morris be the lucky one today, and you get to be the wealthy person. Morris is 10% of the population, and Morris owns 50% of the wealth. That means the next four people, Jen, Ralph, Joanne, Marion, you four have to get up and move. Now, they probably don't want you sitting on their laps over here, so maybe you just want to stand behind their chairs. But you have to get away from those four chairs, and you have to group up with the other five down here. And, well, he might have to move. Okay. Let's see. You can move up to the third chair. How about that? Okay. We'll start there. Okay. So we have, Morris has 50% of the wealth, and all of these folks have the other 50%. So that's 10%. Now, you often hear with the Occupy movement, you heard about the 1%? You hear about the 1% here? So we're going to pretend that Morris's head is 1%, okay? Your head is 1%. Now, you can't, I don't expect you to lay down, but you get the idea. You get the idea. So Morris's head is 1%. His head would get 2 chairs, because the 1% has 20% of the wealth, okay? Now, we fast forward. When I first got this, it was 2004, and I keep checking it, and it's pretty much the same. So I'm going to say fast forward to 2018, let's say. And now, what do you think is going to happen? Yes, I don't know the names of the next two, but Morris is going to get more chairs. He's going to get 7 chairs. So, yeah, the next two, Kathy and I don't know the other dead ones. Ann. Okay, Kathy and Ann have to move. Okay. Pam. Okay, gotcha. Okay, Ralph, you got to move over. You can't be behind the empty chair. No. You got to scrunch up there, guys. Okay. So now we have the top 10% owning 70% of the wealth. And these folks have 3 chairs. Now, that 1%, his head, oh, you're pretty, well, not quite. You got to go back 1 chair. The top 1% owns 40% of the wealth. So see those 4 chairs? That goes to the 1%. So notice that 1% has more than this 90. You only have 3 chairs. And you know, you can say, well, that isn't exactly right. It may or may not be, but it is the trend. It is how things are moving, and that's what's significant for us. Thank you very much. You're very good at that. Well, you lost, I realize that, yes.
No, you can't stay.
I can't stay. I want more money.
Taking you for a ride.
Okay, she's going to move that back, but it's a good exercise to give us a sense. So if that's happening, then what does it say as to how we view things in light of Catholic social teaching? We're always asking ourselves that question. I want to go back to something that Pope Francis says in Joy of the Gospel, because his 2 documents, Laudato Si and Joy of the Gospel, are very, very insightful in all of this. This is what I took from his reading. He says no to an economy of exclusion. He says no to the new idolatry of money. No to a financial system which rules rather than serves. And no to the inequality which spawns violence. He brings that up a number of times, that it's inequality that is going to bring violence into our world. And if you look at history, we know that that is true. Okay, we'll start in now. Mary has number 5. Okay, Mary Kay.
Dignity of work, economic justice. The economy must serve people, not the other way around. Work is more than a way to make a living. It is a form of continuing participation in God's creation. Work must be organized to serve the workers' humanity, support their family life, and increase the common good. If the dignity of work is to be protected, then the basic rights of the workers must be respected. The right to productive work, to decent and fair wages, to the organization and joining of unions, to private property, and to economic initiative.
You remember that Rerum Novarum, that encyclical in 1891, was on the dignity of work. Pope Francis goes on to say that work is fundamental to the dignity of a person. Work, to use an image, anoints us with dignity, fills us with dignity, makes us similar to God, who has worked and still works, who always acts. So I love that image of work anointing us. I know there are times that people would like to say, I wish I didn't have to work. But I also know that when people lose jobs, there's depression, along with loss of income. So work does give us connections, and it gives us a purpose at times. I just want to do a few slides just to establish some of the working documentation here. We have minimum wage, which hasn't changed recently. It did, a number of years went up. So the federal, Illinois' minimum wage is higher than the federal piece. If you worked minimum wage, a 40-hour week, that would be your $15,080 would be your income, and the poverty line for a family of 4 is the $23,656. So you couldn't support a family on it. And I know that some people say, well, minimum wage workers, they've always in the past been teenagers. That's not true anymore. There are a number of people that hold down 2 jobs in order to be able to provide for their family. And then we go to the unemployment piece. Oops, excuse me. The unemployment rate is down. But what always gets me about unemployment, I've read many things about it that said it's not an accurate statistic because many people have just dropped out of the picture of looking for work even. But I also have always understood that according to our economic theory, some unemployment is needed to keep our capitalist economy going. Because you have to have this overabundance of workers in order to feed that economic system. And, but it is lower right now, which is a good thing. However, sometimes those numbers obscure the experience of millions of part-time workers, temp workers, older workers who have been was downsizing and they lost a job. They can't get a job that like they used to have. And others who have done everything right, but are still struggling to find good jobs, jobs that pay for their family. With the government shutdown, I read about one legislator who commented, probably no federal employee lives paycheck to paycheck. I thought, how blind can you be, man? And it was a man. How blind can you be? I think we'd be quite surprised the number of people that live paycheck to paycheck. So the other piece that, as we look at this whole question of workers and what's going on is what happens in terms of, now this is large corporations and CEO pay. So I'm not talking about the business down the street necessarily. But what's happened over the years is the huge increase in CEO pay compared to what workers make. Workers' wages are considered to be fairly stagnant over a period of years, whereas for public corporations, the CEO pay has gone up tremendously. And then for workers, they've lost their power to organize, and to a lot of their worker rights have been diminished in that way. And then when you get power as a big business, you have power to influence policy. When I was speaking about the Koch brothers before, you know, one of their big things is deregulation, to deregulate everything, because then their corporations can make even more money. Now, I don't know, somebody was just talking to me about Amazon and Jeff Bezos. I think Dave said it was 100, or somebody said it was 151 billion. Ralph, you said that. His worth right now is 151 billion. B. I mean, I can't even think what that means. So, how much money does somebody need? Or is it all about power? Is that what this is about? But what's happening, we've got companies that are productive, and yet the money does not go to the workers, it goes to the CEOs and to the shareholders. And that's a pretty significant thing. I have an activity, and I think we've got time to do it. I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I need 8 people. You just hold a card and you walk. That's all you have to do. One person who holds the card just gets to stand still. So can I have 8 folks to come up and do this?
You'd like to walk? Come on.
Kara has the cards, and now if all of you will go and stand over there and face me. If you can kind of stand in a straight line over all the way to the end, back by that chair. And then turn around and face me. You're all across a line. Yeah, that's good. Who's the average worker? Okay, Sister Samuela, you get to stay still. Okay. The average worker, and there's all kinds of ways to calculate that, but anyway, publicly traded companies now have to, in their reports, they have to say how much the CEO pay is times their median or average worker. So they have to make that reporting. But let's just look at what's happened with CEO pay over the years. Who's 1965? 1960, I'm sorry, 1960, there's Pat. Okay, in 1960, the average was 20 times what you made, 20 times what Sister Samuela made. So, and these are averages, just remember that. So, I can't have you take 20 steps, but would you just take 2 steps forward out of the line? Okay, that's good enough. And then is the next one 1989? We have 19, yeah. Okay, Kathy? All right, in 1989 it went up a little bit. It was 50 times as much. So you made 50 times more than Sister Samuela. So just 5 steps. You better not make them too big because we're going to run out of space. And then the next one is 1995. We've grown. It's now, you're making 112 times what Sister Samuela did. So that's 11 steps. Okay, and then I think the next one's year 2000. Oh, booming years. That was 344 times what Sister Samuela made. So now that's 34 steps. After a while, you're going to get tired counting, but we know you're going to be over here by Sister Beth someplace. Okay, so then we go, that was 2000, yeah, she made a lot. Then 2009, remember the recession in 2000, the housing bubble burst? So it went down. It was only 188 times as much as Sister Samuela made. So you have about 19 steps, 2009. Okay, and then we go to 2012. We're working back up again. So yours is 273, so you need 27 steps. That's Pam, I think. And then we have 2017, and it's back up again to 312 times. We're not quite up to 2,000, but Kara, come on. Now, some people say, and they argue, well, CEOs take a lot of responsibility, do a lot of work. I don't think they have 30 times as much, or 300 times as much. I think there's something wrong when that's the way it's set up, that that's how it operates. Because then some of it's based on performance, but some of it's not. You've heard of companies where the company goes bad, the guy gets fired, and he still gets golden parachute. He still gets a lot of money. So, okay, thank you very much, and thanks for collecting those. That just gives you a sense. But notice where the average worker was. And while wages have gone up, some for certain, they have not kept the same pace as other wages, as the CEO wages have done. So we'll move on to the solidarity and peace. Okay, that's another Jen. Where's?
I'm here.
Okay, right here. Okay.
Solidarity and peace. We are one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are our brothers and sisters keepers, wherever they may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions in a shrinking world. In particular, the richer nations have responsibility towards the poorer nations, and people with wealth and resources are linked in the divine economy with those who lack them. At the core of the virtue of solidarity is the pursuit of justice and peace. We are called to be peacemakers. Our love for our sisters and brothers demands that we promote peace in a world surrounded by violence and conflict.
Thank you. Now, as I've said before, you probably noticed that the themes are interrelated. Just think of what she said about solidarity. It builds on dignity of the person, on the common good, and on community. It even builds on our responsibility to and for others. So I'm going to highlight just a number of areas under solidarity and then some relating to peace. And I'll probably be doing this very quickly, but it just gives you a sense of all the things that can be connected. First one I want to look at is, what does solidarity mean for us as we focus on persons who are trafficked? You hear a lot more about human trafficking than we did years ago. It's in people's awareness, and we owe it to victims to be aware of their plight. You may know that Pope Francis and the international groups for religious have designated February 8th as the International Day of Prayer and Awareness for Human Trafficking. And this is Sister Josephine Bakita. She was born in the Sudan. She was kidnapped as a child and sold into slavery about 4 or 5 times. Eventually she was sold to someone who took her back to Italy. And after a time, she was given her freedom and became Canossian sister and dedicated her life to working with others who maybe weren't necessarily trafficked, but who were poor and suffering in some way. And Pope John Paul II declared her a saint in 2000. So we have that day to remember, and so February 8th. In the United States, January, our current month, is Human Traffic Awareness Month. And the focus day for that is January 11th. Our government publishes every June what they call the TRIP report, traffic report on persons. And we talk about other countries and how they are using laws or responding to this whole piece about trafficking. If you are interested in this issue, I was thinking I could send to Sister Joan some links on the internet, because one good link for this is a newsletter called Stop Trafficking. There's a group called U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Trafficking, and it's put out by those sisters, and it's really a very informative newsletter. And when you look at trafficking, I remember hearing this from a Good Shepherd sister at the United Nations. She said, if you're going to work on trafficking, you have to do the analysis. You just don't take people, try to rescue them. This is all connected to economics, huge, huge economics. It's also connected to how women and children are perceived in the world and how they are treated. Some children are sold by their parents because the parents can't afford to care for them. And then I think we tend to think of trafficking as something that happens in other nations. It happens in the United States. There is something called, oops, I'm sorry, I missed this one. This is the one about the cost of it. This is for organized crime, so it's transnational crime industries, it says. It's the organized crime syndicates. Their most income is from drugs, in terms of those trafficking. The second one is counterfeiting, which is a new one for me. And then, and counterfeiting is not just money, it can be high-end purses or something like that. And then the human trafficking. And these are all just estimates based on whatever possibility they could, as they study these things. And the last one is arms trafficking, which I'll talk about a little bit more about later. So there's big money to be made. I remember when we did our trafficking unit, and there was a man who was convicted of trafficking, and he said, once a drug is sold, it's gone. But a girl can be sold over and over and over until she dies or goes mad. That was his comment. So it's a horrible, horrible thing. And then this is the one I was getting ready for with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They take calls about it, and you notice in 2017 they had over almost 8,800 cases, and that dealt with over 10,000 individuals. Look at how many traffickers, 5,000, and then businesses, 1,500, because there are some businesses involved in this to make it happen. And that was an increase from 2016. And then, of course, women and girls comprise the greater percentage of this. Trafficking is often for sex trafficking, excuse me, it's also for labor trafficking as well. So that's just one little piece about a solidarity for us. I think solidarity, and it comes in the same thing, it's connected to our efforts for peace. And when I think of peace, I often think of, over here we have violence. Just think of how many things we try to settle by violence. Assisted suicide, abortion, avenging a killing. I'm mad, so I'll just shoot. Capital punishment, mass shootings, any shooting, bombing raids, war, drones, all the people that we kill now using drones. There are just so many ways that we take life. And sometimes it's not just physical action. Sometimes it is how we demonize others and use very hateful words. That's taking people's lives. Bullying. And it literally takes people's lives, because some people commit suicide because of bullying. And then even our language of how we do programs. Remember these? War on poverty. War on drugs. War on terror. Why is it a war? So that just puts a mindset there for us. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's a Martin Luther King Jr. quote. Wars are poor chisels for carving out peaceful tomorrows. You notice the little dove trying to pull on the soldiers' slacks? That's a picture that when I was at the United Nations in 2009, they had drawings from some of the young people from, I think it was Yugoslavia. They were anti-war drawings. I thought this was very, very clever, and to get the point across. But I want you to know something positive. In 2016, the Vatican plus Pax Christi International did a conference on nonviolence and was trying to talk about the church recommitting to nonviolence. That's what Jesus was about. You know, in his time, if somebody converted, if a soldier converted to Christianity, they could no longer be a soldier. That was part of the basis of how Jesus, of who he was and how he taught. So they had this and they published this and appealed to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence. And they listed some things there. And I can also give you the link for this, because you don't have to remember all of those things. But it's trying to get us back to embracing that. And the other nice thing about this is Pax Christi's continue to meet, and they're going to have another follow-up next spring, or this spring. We're already in 2019. And with the hope that Pope Francis will do an encyclical on nonviolence. So bringing it back into our consciousness in a way that it hasn't been done for a while. But let's go ahead and look at some of the other issues about war. First of all, we know there's a lot of costs to war. One of them, people are killed. PTSD. The environment is damaged. Iraq, they couldn't plant because of all the depleted uranium. That's happened all over the world. Farmers can't go into the fields because of landmines. So those are costs of war. But here's just the big cost. This was 2017. So the U.S. is red. Our budget was $610 billion for defense. The left-hand column are the next 7 highest spending countries. China has quite a bit, but those 7 do not equal what the United States spends on military. And I know we do a lot around the world, but it's something that I always try to keep in mind and look at. And the other thing you have to remember, that $610 billion, it doesn't include anything with nuclear weapons. It doesn't include the Veterans Affairs. It doesn't include pensions for past veterans. It doesn't include the State Department when they finance foreign arms. You know, like we're financing, little groups to fight governments in other places in the world. This doesn't always cover that. The Iraq War was never in this amount. It was separate. It was a supplemental. So this isn't all of it. This doesn't include military-related things like the Homeland Security is not included here. Any intelligence gathering by the NSA or by the FBI, none of that is included here. So it's a lot of money. The other thing is when President Eisenhower was leaving office, he gave a talk, and he warned people about the military-industrial complex, which is when the armed forces and commerce and politics get entwined and become too closely linked. So you have a military-industrial complex, which means you got to have wars someplace, because we got to use all of these weapons that we're buying and all these companies are making. It concerns me that our acting director of defense worked for Boeing. That's a defense contractor, and now he's in charge of the Department of Defense. That says something to me. And then there's a whole question of private contractors. You remembered in the Iraq War about Blackwater and some of them, which have they changed their name because of it. They have a problem, so they'll change their name. And there are numerous companies like that are private mercenary companies. So they'll do the security in place of our own government for our own people. which means you're privatizing and also putting that commercial piece in even stronger. This is, the picture is from around the United Nations. It's outside the United Nations. It's a gift from Switzerland. I always like that every time, because when you go in by the visitor center, that's what you see. But I want to talk a little bit about arms sales. Sorry to say that we are the global leader in that, but the 5 countries that are the largest arms seller, 5 of them that are also the members of the UN Security Council. Now, these are the countries that are having the most say about what's going on in the world. I want to check something. Yeah. Here's the international arms sales. We're the tallest bar. We have 34% of them. It's interesting. I found out when I was updating all my information and preparing for this, Saudi Arabia receives the largest percentage of our sales. 18%. So that said something to me when we won't press Saudi Arabia for killing Khashoggi, the journalist, because we're too dependent on them to buy our arms. Do you see the complexity of all of these things? And we don't have answers for them, but they are complex. There's no simple way to get out of it. But our understanding of it makes us a little wiser in the whole picture. Then the next thing I want to just do a brief thing with is, well, I don't know why it's not moving, Beth.
Oh. It could be. Oh, there you go.
Oh.
Try again.
No, that's going back.
Hit the forward one.
I am. Okay, can you go out and just move it up? I'll start talking about it anyway. It has to do with the whole question of incarceration, because that has something to do with peace in our country. We have 2.2 million people in prison. If they were all in one city, they'd be the 5th largest city in the United States after New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston. Then the next largest city would be all of our incarcerated. The crime rate's been decreasing. That's true. But even though that's happening, we still have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And what I'm always noticing by
Let's see. I think it's this one.
there, that's the one I want, yeah.
Huh. Oh,
There
there
it
you
is.
go.
I don't know why it stops, but anyway.
It didn't.
Oh, it didn't stay.
There you try one more. Go forward again.
Okay, there we are.
Who knows?
That just shows from the 1920s how we've increased it. And part of that was the mandatory sentencing. It's our war on drugs, because we put a lot of people behind bars under that. Even nonviolent offenders got put in prison for that. A lot of women got put in prison because they were given up by their partners or some guy who said, oh, he was told, if you tell on her, then you get a lesser sentence. And so a lot of women got roped into prison in those days too. But you can see the increase of it. But what I noticed is, in our states, if you looked at the state graphing, 7 of the 10 states that have the largest incarceration rates are in the South, which means they were former slave states. If you notice, I sent out an execution list, and not all, because Ohio has some, Nebraska might have one. Most of the executions are in former slave states, which tells you a relationship of what states are trying to do in terms of persons of color. And then it's not just incarceration, it's probation and parole. I heard a segment on NPR just the other day when I was driving home about a man who chose to stay in prison over probation because he said court costs are too much for probation. he couldn't drive, so he had to take public transportation. He had to take off work, and he might be late because public transportation wasn't always right on time and reliable. And then if you're late, that gets marked against you. You get added on to your probation, cost you something more. And he said, he just gave up. He said, I'll spend my probation in prison, and then when I get out, I'm free. So it's, there's just so many layers to this and complexities. The other piece that I was thinking of, and I'm conscious of it because Florida voted in the 2018 elections, they voted to overturn their anti-felon laws, so that in Florida, the only time you're ineligible to vote is if you're in prison, on parole, or on probation. If you're if you've been in prison and had a felony, but you're finished, then you have a right to vote. Many states disenfranchise felons for life instead of just letting them serve their term and then letting them come back to be part of society. And then when we go to prisons, this is a picture from Stewart Detention Center in Lumpkin, Georgia. When we went to the School of the Americas vigil one year, we went over to a vigil here. But this is it's a private detention center. 73% of all immigrants detained by the federal government are held in private prisons. So now we have not only the military industrial complex, we have the prison industrial complex, where you have the prison officials, you have commerce, and you have politics together in that. It is the private prison groups that are one of the main influencers of tougher enforcement of immigration laws, because they don't get enough money unless there are immigrants detained that helps to pay for their prisons. It's just an awkward thing. And as we look at the whole question of immigrants here, this came out last year about 68.5 million people they're either internally displaced, which is the 40, refugees, which is 25, or asylum seekers, which is 3. So all of those people, which are about the size of the population of France, don't have a home. They don't have a place to call home, because a refugee camp is not exactly a nice place to call home. Currently, these are the top refugee host countries. Not all of them, but a lot of them are poor countries. And like Jordan has so many, they have 2.9 million. Jordan has no oil, so other countries have to help support them. And just now, I learned that our government is putting the cap of 30,000 on the number of refugees we'll take, when a couple of years ago it was 100,000, 85,000, 100,000. And we're capping it at 30,000 this next year. So what does solidarity mean with our brothers and sisters when it comes to refugees and migrants? Those are just questions for us. As I said before, these are complex issues. They're not easy solutions. And if you're interested in the immigration piece, our U.S. bishops have a campaign or a project they call Justice for Immigrants. And what I'll do is give Sister Joan a link for that, so she can send those to you if you're interested in that piece. And I'd like to move on to our last one. Something happened again, Beth. I don't know what's doing. But while you're fixing that, Sister Pat can go ahead and read about Care for Creation.
Care for Creation. We are all part of the community of creation and show our respect for the Creator by our care of creation. We are called to protect people and the planet, living our faith in relationship with all of God's creation. Catholic social thought has explicitly addressed environmental and ecological concerns in rather recent times. But the concern for respecting, sharing, and caring for creation has always been part of the tradition. Recent statements on the importance of environmentally and socially sustainable patterns of consumption and development have built solidly upon that part of the tradition. This environmental challenge has fundamental moral and ethical dimensions that cannot be ignored.
Thank you. This is one of my favorite pictures, our Earth from space. You know, we often have used the words that we are stewards of creation. Now, stewardship is a good word as long as it doesn't mean power over, because we are really stewarding under the image of God. We aren't managers of creation, but we exist with it. We're a part of it, not apart from it. And Pope Francis says that he wished to mention another threat to peace, which arises from the greedy exploitation of environmental resources. Even if nature is at our disposition, all too often we do not respect it or consider it a gracious gift, which we must care for and set at the service of our brothers and sisters, including future generations. When he says that, it makes me think of that ancient proverb, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So whatever we do here, we're taking away from the future. Now, this principle has humongous things that we could address, but I'm just going to pick up on a few. First one has to do with climate change. And you remember in December of 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted. Now, the U.S. administration has rejected the agreement, but states and businesses are committed to moving forward with this. And Pope Francis says we are confronted with a choice which cannot be ignored, either to improve or destroy the environment. And if we destroy it, we're destroying ourselves. And as far as scientists are concerned, human activity is causing the earth to get warmer. That's an agreement by the huge, huge majority of scientists. Okay, and here's the next one I wanted to highlight. Glaciers are sometimes called the sentinels of climate change. They're the most visible evidence of warming today. The top and the bottom are the same place, just decades apart. So as the glaciers and the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica melt, they add more water to the ocean. That causes sea levels to rise. And then people that are dependent on water from the glaciers then are at risk, because once it goes into the ocean, it becomes a salt water. And you know, the neat thing about Earth and our planet and all that God made is the marvel of the complex relationships that exist. There's much news right now about the loss of bee colonies and what that means for us and our being able to survive because of the pollination work they do. Well, I just had a recent conversation because there was a report that came out that talked about the insect population and the significant decreases in the insect population. Now, insects are, maybe we don't like them, you know, running around our kitchen or something like that, but they're very important for our world and our livelihood. They break down things, they control weeds. They're also, they provide raw materials for medicine too. So the person said to me that I was talking about this with, she said, do you notice many bugs on your windshield? And I thought, I hadn't even thought about that, but that's true. When I was driving this summer, I never had a bug problem on my windshield. And I realized, no, there weren't many. And that's because of the significant decrease in insects. Now, If you're cleaning your windshield, you're really happy. But if you're talking about the future of our life, not so happy. Those are just issues connected to this. And the last one I want to talk about has to do with, oh, you're going to have to do it again. Has to do with water. You can survive a month without food, but you can't survive maybe a week or so without drinking water. And children die every day because they don't have clean water, potable water. So I want to just give you some ideas about the water we do have. Right now, our water, all the water on Earth, is 97% it's salt. Now, I know somebody's going to say, well, we'll just figure out a way to take the saline out of it, and where are we going to put the salt? And then 3% of that is fresh water. Of that fresh water, 0.5% is available for us to use. Now, that's a very small amount of water in the whole world. Go to the next one, Beth. So, here's a way to visualize it. If our water supply were 100 liters, that's 26 gallons. Think of 26 gallon cartons of milk. Just picture those. Our usable water supply of fresh water would be about a half teaspoonful out of that. That's the proportion we're talking about. That's why water is so hugely important, and what we do with water is hugely important. That's why fracking uses huge amounts of water. We also need to be concerned because to make our Intel chips for all of our devices take huge amounts of water for production. And I'm not saying we do without those things, but it's got to be in our awareness of how we take care of it. So for me, the thing that I always talk about is the privatization of water. Most of us, you can get water through the tap from your city or town. But selling water is a billion-dollar business. And if we regularly buy bottled water, and I'm not saying you can't or you shouldn't, because I travel sometimes when I'm in another country that doesn't have good drinking water, I buy bottled water. But anytime, if you regularly do it, you are contributing to the privatization of water. And there are companies that want to take over towns' whole water distribution. So it's hugely more expensive than tap water. It's not tested nearly as much as your city is required to test your tap water. I know some people don't like the taste of their tap water, and I can't do anything about that. One of them up here is Nestle. You know the story of Flint, Michigan. Do you know that Nestle pays $200 a year to the state of Michigan to get 130 million gallons of water for their $7 billion business? And they wanted to up it. They sued a township that wouldn't allow them to have water from their aquifer. They sued them. So now, it sounds like, well, we're bottling water and we'll take it back to Flint. Well, the people in Flint have a problem with this. Here's a company who's bottling the water from their state and are selling it back to people who have to buy it through no fault of their own, because we all know what happened in Flint, Michigan. So those kinds of things are just anathema for our care of creation and what we are about. And I finally want to close. Oops, got just a couple. This will be very short. I think a way to think about our Catholic social teaching tradition is to say that we use the two books. We use the book of the gospel and we use the book of life. And, you know, if you read the gospel, you apply that to what you see and hear. And for us Dominicans, truth has not just ever been in scripture and theology. Truth is in our world, it's in sociology, it's in science, it's in all kinds of study. And today I've lifted up I've given you the principles, and also touched on just a few issues from the Book of Life. And I believe that we're called to something that says no to the injustices that harm others in creation. It's not easy to do. Sometimes all you can do is just be aware of it and just have a presence to say, I don't agree with that. And in doing that, you always need the support of others. So for us in community, this is what we're about. We do this work together. So I've given you a booklet sheet here called our corporate stances. And Sister Beth, if you want to take down them. We as a community have a process for determining what we call a corporate stance, which means that we agree upon a position about a justice issue. It allows leadership to speak about it and to act in the name of the entire congregation. And so these are ones that we've approved over the last 25 years. We do study, we do analysis, and then we do our decision making. Something else, and I will give you the link for this if you haven't seen it before. We also do this with the larger Dominican family. The Dominican Justice Promoters meet every year, and every 2 years we do a call to justice that we send out to all the Dominicans so it can focus on some areas that we can work on together. I also send out information and alerts to sisters and associates. And maybe you don't want to act on the email that I sent. That's fine. I don't think all of our sisters do either. You can end up deleting it. But what I do ask you to do is to pray about it and be aware of what the issue is, what issue is lifted up. We can all do that and add our prayer energy to making good in the world. I was telling someone that I place my hope in the fact that there are good people in this world that are working on all of these issues. There are different groups and different folks. And that's what gives me hope that we will continue to have life and that we will continue to have justice. So blessings on you as you read the Bible along with the Book of Life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sister Marcelline, for the lessons from the two books, from Scripture and the Book of Life. But also thank you for your wealth of information, which comes from your wealth of experience. I don't think there's any doubt in our minds as to why Sister is the leader of as justice promoter for our community. So we're very, very grateful, Sister, for today. I'd like to thank those also who brought snacks today, to Jen Graves and to Rose Lynn and Joanne Lynn. They were very healthy. Thank you, after all of our sweets of Christmas. Our snacks for February will be provided by Ralph Metz and Dave Sanders, our two men among us. And also thanks to our Springfield associates who are here each week helping us with our meetings. Is there any other associate candidate who is not receiving the communications from me? Like recently I sent you a copy of the article from Joan Chittister, and you should be receiving also the emails about prayers that I sent out. Any other associate not doing that? Okay, we missed one, so we want to be sure that everybody's on the mailing list. I would ask that you continue to work with that article from Joan Chittister, A Call to Be Heard. And if you can, to talk about it with your sponsor that you have. If there's anything that strikes you in the article, if you could send me an email regarding that and I could share it with the entire group. One of our candidates this week that I ran into when she was attending Mass says, after reading the article, now I know why I am here. Because Joan Chittister speaks of the truth that comes from each one of us, and each of us brings a different perspective to that truth because of the lives that we live. So it's ours, as Isaiah said, to spread that light, and we can spread the light farther when we're doing it together. So that's really the bottom line of what Joan Chittister is saying to us. Our next meeting is going to be held on the first Sunday of February, which is February the 3rd. And it's a different type of presentation, as there will be 3 different presentations given on that day. The title is Uncovering the Light of the Gospel. And I would ask that if you could plan to be here from 1 o'clock to 3:30 on that day, so that we can give each of those groups who are presenting a little bit more time for the day. Our speakers will include Sister Rosemary Schulte and Daphne Skredvet, who will be presenting on our anti-racism efforts. Sister Rosemary Riley, who will address the work at Jubilee Farm. Sister Claire Fickner, Sister Lori Kirchman, and Sister Beth Murphy. Sister Beth we have with us most of the time, who will speak about Cor Unum, which is our Dominican House of Hospitality, which they are getting ready to move into very soon. So may your month of February be blessed and filled with God's light, and safe travels home. Thank you for being with us today. And thanks again to Sister Marcelline.